Shu Hun, Early Autumn. The pure sound of a lute fills the long night. A west wind shakes the blue wisteria. The last fireflies nest among pearls of dew. Fall's first geese brush the river of stars. Tall trees at dawn, still lush with leaves. Far mountains, endless in pure light. One leaf falls south of the Huai, and I feel the waves rise on Lake Dongting. So here we have the second and last poem of Shu Hun in the 300 Tang Poems Anthology. It has many parallelisms to the previous one by him. It's also an autumn poem. Remember, autumn is the favored season for poetry in Chinese poetry because of its combination of beauty but also sadness and melancholy. And the tone of most Chinese poems, or at least of the classical ones, tends always to be this bittersweet, melancholy type of feeling, which would be considered, I don't know, the elegant or the adequate response to the world. So this is a specific subtype of autumn poem. In this case, we don't have any indications of traveling, although, as we will comment when we reach the last couplet, we do have a very specific geographical setting, which is not presented until the end of the poem. But so the topic of this poem is purely naturalistic, seasonal, and descriptive. So a description of nature. I was saying early autumn. I'm not sure. In the Chinese tradition, I have read a lot of poems in the Japanese tradition of waka, which includes as a subgenre early seasonal poems. Not only a poem about the seasons, or a specific season, but a poem about the beginning of the season, when you can see or when you can hear the first indication, the first animal or plant or flower or element of nature that indicates that the new season has started. And this type of early season poems was very much liked. Lots of them in the Kokinshu and about spring, early spring, or about early autumn. And I imagine in Chinese classical poetry, including the one I haven't read, this is probably quite a conventional topic. Yeah? It has this exploratory element and this appreciation of newness in the eagerness of the right of the poetic persona to engage with and to discover and to describe these first gentle stirrings of change, of a seasonal change. Remember, Chinese traditional philosophy, and here we are connecting with correlative thought, with Jing Jiang, with the Book of Changes, the I Ching. All of these texts, I'm especially thinking about the last one, which was read a lot by scholar officials because it was one of the classics, put the emphasis on in different stages of change and how the wise man, the scholar official, is able to read the cycle of the seasons, the cycles of change, the cycles of nature and society to act accordingly. Although in this case, I don't think a political reading is warranted. I think this is, just a aesthetic appreciation of the beauty and of the freshness of the oncoming season. Okay, so after having given this intro, let's go to the poem couplet by couplet. First couplet. The pure sound of a lute fills the long night. A west wind shakes the blue wisteria. So, generally, in a lot of descriptive poems of the Chinese tradition, we get what we could describe a zoom-in evolution of the poem, in which you start with the more background or abstract or generic elements of nature and the landscape, and then we couplet by couplet we get focused and more focused, and we get into smaller and smaller details that are also closer to the poetic persona himself or herself. Here we've got the opposite thing. Instead of a zoom in, we've got a zoom out, or something slightly reminding us of a zoom out. We get from the more specific and the more human and the more social, I would say, to the more generic. So this first couplet basically presents us with a sound, and well, first of all, it's at night, so very interesting. This doesn't give away the season at all, although autumn nights are generally appreciated because they represent a coolness, a loving coolness, opposed to the stifling heat of summer nights. But anyway, the fact that the poem is placed or starts at night doesn't give away the season. The pure sound of a lute fills the long night. Well, it's a long night, so it's probably not a summer night. Yeah, could be a winter night, but it's a long night. And we have a human element, a sound. It's not a visual element. It's dark, it's night, a lute. So somebody is not sleeping, somebody. This is another subgenre of Chinese poetry, of which I think we've encountered a few poems in the collection. Wakefulness at night. A person, whether a man or a woman, for subjective reasons and feelings, cannot sleep and spends the night awake, muses himself or herself playing the lute. So we have these sounds of a lute being played, a pure sound coming from somewhere. We don't know where, it's night and we can't see anything. And we also have the west wind blowing. The west wind cannot be seen as such, and it's night. But it's shaking the blue wisteria. Wisteria is a flower that we have a lot today, at least in Spain. You know, it's like a climbing vine. It gives very beautiful flowers, which are not blue actually. At least the ones I know are more like purple. And you know, they're like grapey flowers. You know, they hang down in beautiful hanging, purpley knots. So the west wind shakes the blue wisteria. Perhaps close to the poem there is a wisteria plant, and he can actually see the plant, the leaves, maybe the flowers, shaking slightly in the wind. Here we do start to have indications of the season. West wind. West in Chinese correlative thought is correlated with autumn. That is, there is a whole series of connections. West, I think the metal of the five elements, iron, what else? The color white. The animal is the tiger. The direction is west. You know, in Chinese correlative thought, the west is evoked by a lot of things. So west wind is specifically an autumn wind, bringing the coolness. Yeah, so we have this west wind. I'm not sure when the wisteria flowers, but very probably it will do so in autumn, I imagine, and that would help to anchor maybe a late summer. So maybe it would help to anchor the poem in this ambiguity. I think it actually flowers in the summer, but I don't know. I have to check. So, okay, the first couplet locates us. There is a sound of a lute. There is a west wind blowing and shaking the wisteria a little bit. So we might imagine these things happen in the immediate surrounding of the poet. And one of them is clearly a human thing. Next couplet. The last fireflies nest among pearls of dew. Fall's first geese brush the river of stars. The second couplet, as we usually remind ourselves, is the first of the parallelistic couplets, and I think can be easily seen here. In the second couplet, we have animal images from the season, basically two, fireflies and geese. Both are pretty good indicators of autumn. Fireflies or other insects tend to die out throughout autumn and to end up disappearing. They're still very abundant in early autumn, but in late autumn or in early winter, they finally die out or disappear or bury themselves under the ground. And geese migrate, so they can be seen in spring and in autumn in places where migrating geese are found, whether coming to or leaving for another place. Look at the parallelism. So last fireflies versus first geese, nest versus brush, pearls of dew, river of stars. So it's very well crafted. So the last fireflies, because they're dying out, they're nesting among pearls of dew. Dew is also a symbol. Dew and frost are the harbingers of autumn. Dew first of autumn, frost then of winter. So they're pearls of dew. Dew is forming at night, and the last fireflies nest next to the dew, next to the water. As opposed to this, number of small insects, of small shining lights next to the jewel-like consistency of the dew, we have one solitary geese. And this one is the first geese of the year, so it's not the last like the fireflies. And it's brushing past. It's not nesting, it's moving. It's a dynamic image. It brushes past the river of stars, which again connotes a jewelly-like image, a river of stars, a river of jewels. This is a poetic way of referring to the Milky Way. And this is an aerial image, whereas the fireflies nesting on the dew would be an earthly image. But anyway, we have the insects of the season. Third couplet. Now we move further back and we get a greater background of trees and mountains, which forests and rivers are taken generally as synecdoche for nature. Tall trees at dawn, still lush with leaves. Far mountains, endless, impure light. Now, as we reach the third couplet, which is also parallelistic, it's becoming morning. We were at night at the beginning of the poem. Now it's becoming morning. So it's dawn. You can see the tall trees rising up in the mountains, very vertical image, and they're still lush with leaves. Remember, this is early autumn, which means most of the trees are still green. The leaf hasn't changed color yet to red and brown. It's going to start, but it hasn't quite started yet, at least not for most of the trees. Far mountains, endless, impure light. So in the pure light of morning, dawn is always associated with purity, with cleanness. We can see, mountains extending beyond the horizon and beyond, as far as the gaze can catch. Yeah, they're also an image of elevation, of verticality. And we might imagine the mountains covered with those trees from the previous line. Finally, the last couplet. Up to now, we've been in some generically vague, unspecified location. The last couplet focuses on where we actually are in this early beginning of autumn. One leaf falls south of the Huai, and I feel the waves rise on Lake Dongting. So the last couplet locates us in the south of China. Now, it says we are south of the Huai River and probably quite close to Lake Dongting. So this is the area of the lower course of the Jiangsu River, in the territory of the old state of Chu. The south has not a tropical, it has a semi-tropical, Mediterranean-like climate, I would venture to guess, with the difference being that in the South China climate, the summer is very wet, whereas in the Mediterranean climate, the summers tend to be dry and stifling hot. In both places in the summer. So we're south of the Huai. Autumn comes later here. So we might imagine that perhaps by the calendar we're already in autumn, but in this area of China, it's still starting to be felt. Only one leaf has fallen. Perhaps we might imagine north of the Huai River. Autumn has already come in full swing, and most of the trees, or a big percentage of them, have lost their leaves. So this is what the poem has been building up to with indirect elements, but this is the first clear, unequivocal, visual element that denotes spring has come, leaves fall. And there's also a second element that is also very, very, very typically autumny, although this is more hermetic for our culture. I feel the waves rise on Lake Dongting because of the different flows and of different other phenomena. I imagine the Jiangzi carries a greater current in autumn, and Lake Dongting is one of the biggest lakes in southern China. It's connected to the Jiangzi River. We've already talked about Lake Dongting in previous poems, some poems describing it or describing pavilions or cities on the shores of Lake Dongting. It's a beautiful sight. And the idea is in autumn, the waves in the lake rise higher than they do in spring. So we get these two images of of autumn coming. Fallen leaves, rising waves. And, again, take a look at the contrastive parallelism, which is, quite well crafted. So the leaves are falling down, and they're falling south of the Huai. The waves are rising up. yeah, while we are on Lake Tonting. So, I think quite a nice set of images. The topic of the poem is, you could say, relatively conventional, but I think it has been crafted with more than decent mastery.